Buongiorno, buongiorno a tutti and a very warm welcome to our international guests. Grazie per aver accolto il nostro invito per questo pomeriggio dedicato al Giappone. L'interesse per ciò che avviene in Giappone, ciò che avviene in una delle potenze economiche di questo nostro mondo, ha seguito negli ultimi decenni un andamento a singhiozzo. Grande interesse negli anni 70-80, quando la grande ascesa giapponese interessava e preoccupava soprattutto in Europa e negli Stati Uniti. A questo grande interesse degli anni 70-80 ha fatto seguito il grande oblio degli lunghi anni della stagnazione e delle difficoltà dell'economia e della società giapponese, un oblio che si accompagnava sul Giappone alla nuova attenzione per altri paesi dell'Asia che in quegli anni cominciavano a muoversi con velocità. Negli ultimi anni, a partire dal 2007-2008 quantomeno, assistiamo a un rinnovato interesse negli Stati Uniti e in Europa per ciò che avviene in Giappone. Il primo è un interesse in negativo. Il Giappone visto come esempio da non seguire per uscire dalla crisi. Molto spesso durante i primi anni della crisi finanziaria ed economica nostra abbiamo letto e anche discusso in taluni momenti su ciò che dovevamo evitare, cioè i 20 anni di uscita dalla crisi. Poi più recentemente, quantomeno dal governo di Abe, questo interesse in negativo si è trasformato in interesse anche in positivo, perché nella rilettura che abbiamo fatto e che facciamo con i nostri occhi di ciò che avviene in Giappone, il successo o l'insuccesso della politica espansionistica del nuovo governo giapponese, oltre ad avere ovvie ripercussioni sui nostri mercati, darebbe forza a una delle due fazioni del dibattito europeo fra rigore e politica espansionistica. L'ISPI è un istituto di ricerca e in quanto tale, nonostante la scarsità di risorse, ha cercato in questi decenni di tenere un'attenzione costante e sobria su ciò che in Giappone accadeva e accade. Abbiamo per anni mantenuto un appuntamento fisso con cadenza annuale o biennale e in questi appuntamenti abbiamo accompagnato sia le fasi difficili dell'economia che fasi più solari e positive più recenti. Non abbiamo neanche noi dell'ISPI dimenticato altre zone, altri paesi dell'Asia e negli ultimi anni, se prendo gli ultimi 4 anni, alle 4 conferenze fatte sul Giappone abbiamo affiancato i 3 incontri sulla Cina, i 3 incontri sull'India e da quest'anno, da dicembre, anche un'iniziativa sulla Corea. Lo facciamo anche oggi con 2 panel che vedono la presenza di ricercatori italiani, giapponesi ed europei e anche di esponenti autorevolissimi del mondo delle imprese. Lo facciamo anche oggi per discutere un po' a fondo del nuovo protagonismo di questa fase politica ed economica del Giappone, non nascondendo, anzi interrogandoci sul significato e sulla portata di questa fase di trasformazione. Qualche dubbio c'è sulla politica economica, se è vero come è vero che da aprile in poi il PIL del Giappone, dopo la ripresa di questi anni, ha avuto un ulteriore raffreddamento. Qualche punto di domanda c'è sul negoziato, l'importante negoziato transpacifico di libero scambio con gli Stati Uniti. Qualche dubbio c'è se in politica estera il rinnovato protagonismo nella regione del Giappone continua a mantenere tensioni non placate con altri attori e ovviamente con la Cina in particolare. Di questo parliamo oggi. Desidero di nuovo ringraziare tutti voi che avete accolto il nostro invito per questa giornata sul Giappone, ringraziare i relatori, il console generale del Giappone che ci onora oggi con la sua presenza e i partner di questa iniziativa, l'Asso Lombarda e la Fondazione Toshiba. Grazie a voi e buon lavoro a Axel Berkowski che seguirà la prima sessione.
Grazie mille Paolo Magri. Cambiamo lingua, da ora in poi parliamo in inglese, la conferenza è in inglese, però c'è la traduzione. Yeah, first of all, again, thank you very much for your introduction, Paolo, and thank you to all of you for showing up, because it's not easy when we, or when not only here, but in all over Europe, when think tanks, universities organize events on Asia, there are two categories. The events on China and the other events. Japan very often falls under the category of other events. However, given the changes that we have seen in Japan, economic changes and the changes on the foreign and security policy agenda over the last years in Japan, Japan is back on the agenda. Japan is again interesting, and people are again much more interested in Japan than only two years ago. Lots of changes, of course, and we'll discuss those changes during the first session on the foreign and security policy agenda, thanks to the policies adopted by Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, and of course because Japan is back also economically. You know, sure, the news, and Paolo Magri indicated them. The news are not only good news coming from Japan, economically speaking. However, things have been changing, things have been evolving very much and very quickly in Japan over the last 18 months. So we're very happy to host this conference today. And given the number of people here today, you can see there is still interest in Japan. Japan is still an interesting country. And after all, Japan is and will remain for the years ahead the world's third biggest economy. So very happy to see so many of you here today. Now, the first session we have two speakers and three discussants. Our speaker, our guest from Japan, is Professor Yuichi Hosoya from Keio University, and he's not only a professor from Keio University, but he's also somebody who can give us a lot of insight into Japanese foreign and security policy making, because he's part of a number of panels and advisory councils directly advising the Japanese Prime Minister on Japanese foreign and security policy. So we'll expect from him some inside views, inside analysis of what is going on Japan's foreign and security policy. When we speak about Japan and gradual changes, we of course, and Paul Mitford, the other speaker today from the Norwegian Institute for Science and Technology in Norway, when we speak about those changes today, of course, when we speak about Japan, China comes to mind, the relationship between Japan and China, the territorial dispute with China, Shinzo Abe's plans to reinterpret, to maybe also rewrite the Japanese war-renouncing constitutions, and many other countries many other changes in terms of security and foreign policy that would be considered as normal as in other countries. But given that Japan, in terms of foreign and security policies, given its historical background, given its war-renouncing constitution, many things that are taking place on Japan's security policy agenda, many changes that the Prime Minister is seeking to adopt today are still considered as fairly unnormal, fairly controversial, fairly open to debate in Japan. Nonetheless, Shinzo Abe has been pushing ahead, has been creating some suspicion in South Korea and China that Japan is, on its way, or supposedly on its way back to becoming an aggressive military power, whereas reality, and I'm sure Paul Mitford and Yuichi Hosoya will enlighten us on this, whereas reality is very far away from this, meaning that Japan is becoming a normal country in terms of foreign and security policies but it's not becoming a militarist, aggressive power. Together with Paul and Yuichi, we have 3 discussions. So we have Matteo Dian, we have Noemi Launa, and we have myself giving a few comments on the speeches by Yuichi and Paul, to whom I will hand over the word now. Over to you, 15 minutes if you can do that, and the same for you. And then again, thank you very much for coming today, and thank you for showing your interest in Japan. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Oh yes, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much indeed to come to this seminar on Japan, and Japan really back? Very important and interesting topic. And also, I'm grateful that many of you are interested in the future of Japanese foreign policy, because the future of East Asia international relations will be largely decided by the course of Japanese foreign policy, or the course of the Sino-Japanese relations. And I will talk on the evolution of Japanese security policy. It would be perhaps sometimes difficult to fully understand what the Prime Minister Abe's administration is trying to do. Well, I'm really glad to be able to talk on this topic, because in Europe, sometimes Prime Minister Abe's intention is misunderstood. Well, the picture is the picture of Prime Minister Abe's advisory panel. And 2 from the right, far right, you see my face. And this doesn't mean that I'm much more far right-wing than Prime Minister Abe. This is just, I'm asked to sit over there. It's not ideological. But anyway, I have been quite fortunate to be able to listen to what Prime Minister Abe is thinking about on security policy. And nearly every month in the last 1 year, I could hear his opinion on the future of East Asia international relations. And my feeling, I also originally misunderstood his perception and understanding. He is, from my point of view, much more pragmatic. And the 2 biggest agenda for him, Prime Minister Abe, is 1. Exclusively, I think this agenda is important. First, he tried to revitalize Japanese economy. This is his biggest aim. This is what he spoke last week's speech in Milano, the ASEM conference. And without reviving or revitalizing Japanese economy, Japan cannot play an important role in international community. And then his second big aim is to internationalize Japanese security policy, or to make Japan a leading major power in international community with revitalized economy, Japanese economy. So these 2 things are his important goals. And of course, to revitalize Japanese economy, it is essential for Japan to have a friendly, good relationship with China, because China is Japan's biggest economic trading partner. So it's nonsense to say that Prime Minister Abe wants a war, or it's nonsense to say that Japan has been damaging the Sino-Japanese relations, because without a friendly relationship with China, Japan cannot revitalize its economy. And also, growth. It is essential for Japan to have a peaceful, stable international order in East Asia. So what Prime Minister Abe is doing in his security policy is to stabilize Asia, not to destroy stability in East Asia. So I will talk a little about these things in my 15-minute presentation.
12.
I'm sorry, 12 minutes. Yes, I understand. Well, Prime Minister Abe used the word proactive contribution to peace based on international cooperation. The basic assumption is like this. Well, recently, Japanese government is thinking that due largely to its financial problem, the United States more or less reduced its commitment in East Asia. And this has been a very important destabilizing factor, uncertain factor which decides the future of East Asian international order. Because of the decrease in American commitment in East Asia, even though the US government has repeated to say that the United States maintain its rebalancing strategy in East Asia, but largely due to its financial problems, it would be difficult for the United States to increase its budget, defense budget. So one of the basic assumptions of Prime Minister Abe of Japanese government is that Japan has to play a larger role in international community. Japan should not be a free rider, and Japan should not be an isolationist country, but Japan should become an active, proactive player in international community. And secondly, of course, Japan cannot alone play this important role. Japan should enhance its security cooperation with other like-minded countries. Other like-minded countries include Australia, India, and Korea, and Southeast Asian countries as well. Nowadays, Australia has been becoming a sort of a Japanese virtual ally. And Japan is enhancing its security cooperation with Australia because Australia is a democratic country and share many important norms and also many important goals. That's why Japanese relationship with Australia is also very important. And also India is very important strategic partner in Japan. By enhancing Japan's security cooperation, Japanese government is now thinking that Japan can enhance rule-based international order in the Asia Pacific. And also, Prime Minister Abe is quite confident in arguing that Japan can remain as a major global player in world politics. This is written in Japan's first national security strategy, which was published December last year. And I also play some role to draft that document. And this part is strongly maintained by me. I argued and persuaded Prime Minister Abe. Prime Minister Abe had the same understanding about Japan's role. But 2 years before, very important policy recommendation report written by Joseph Nye of Harvard University and also Richard Armitage jointly. In that report, it was written that the main question is whether Japan can remain as a first-tier nation or leading country, major player in world politics. And the national security strategy paper clearly replies to the question. Japan remain as a major global player. To remain as a leading major player in the world politics, it is necessary to revitalize Japanese economy. That's why first aim, priority for Prime Minister Abe is to revitalize Japanese economy. This is singularly most important goal, to revitalize Japanese economy, to play a larger role, to create both peace and stability in East Asia. And Prime Minister Abe's grand strategy is quite simple. He really focused on the importance of norms and values, particularly democracy and freedom and the rule of law, human rights, and so on. For Prime Minister Abe, international order must be based on shared value. Without such shared norms and values, international order cannot be stabilized. That's why international order in the Asia Pacific should be based on these norms. by sharing these norms, he thinks that Asia can enjoy peace and stability. At the center of the Asia-Pacific International Order, Prime Minister Abe thinks that the US-Japan alliance has to be the core of the entire regional order, because United States and Japan are two biggest democracies for a long time. Of course, India, Australia join that alliance to stabilize the region, but the US-Japan alliance should be the center of this international order. And Prime Minister Abe wrote in December 2012, just a few weeks after he became Prime Minister, he wrote a very interesting article. The title of the article is Asia's Democratic Security Diamond. This diamond consists of four corners, four powers: Japan, the United States, Australia, and India. These four democracies must play important roles to create international order based on democracy and also the rule of law, human rights, and so on. So this is basically Prime Minister Abe's grand strategy. As I said, his grand strategy is based on sharing of important norms and values. And then Japan's national security strategy. At the basis of this national security strategy, the sharing of values or value-oriented diplomacy is at the center. And Japan plays an important role to create and consolidate this international order. Of course, one of the biggest target is the role of China. The important question is whether China can join in this international order based on values and norms. Of course, it is difficult for China to fully advocate democracy, but of course, China can also defend some elements of democratic order in East Asia. So this is one of the reasons why Hong Kong issue is very important criteria for the future of Asia, whether China would undermine democratic values or whether China can jointly advocate some of the important norms in the region. And then Prime Minister Abe decided to change the legal basis for security by trying to make Japan exercise collective self-defense. Some people argue that this would be an example of Japan is going to be quite militaristic. But this is not the case, because the area which Japan can exercise its collective self-defense is extremely small. So this is completely different from other major countries, like, of course, Italy, UK, France, the United States, Canada. Japan can only exercise its collective self-defense right in very, very minor cases. The one example is logistical supports. When something happened in the Korean Peninsula, until recently, Japan cannot provide logistical support to US forces, like fueling operations, or providing some material to the US forces in Japan. Without such logistical support, of course, the United States cannot play an important role in the Korean Peninsula. So that's why US forces repeatedly ask Japanese government to be able to exercise its collective defense rights. So logistical support is one important area. The other area which Japan can do from now on is to do more role in international peacekeeping operations. Because of the legal obstacles, it was difficult for Japanese government to widen Japanese engagement in international peacekeeping operations. But by loosening Japanese constitutional interpretation on collective self-defense, Japan can now play a larger role in international peacekeeping operations. Well, this is largely because both European countries and the American government have faced important financial problems. So that's why repeatedly both US government and the NATO asked Japan to play a larger role in joint operations. But joint operations means that the Japan should exercise collective self-defense. Well, that's why Japanese government has never sent any personnel to NATO. It was impossible for Japanese government to place Japanese personnel, self-defense forces personnel inside of the NATO, because this, according to Japanese government, means the exercise of the collective self-defense, completely different from ordinary understanding. So that's why the advisory panel, in which I am also a member, submitted a report to the government, in which the group strongly asked the government to change the previous constitutional interpretation on the collective self-defense. This is largely for the purpose of internationalizing Japanese security policy. Japanese security policy has been quite isolationistic, denying any deeper cooperation with other countries. But Japan should no more be an isolationistic country. But otherwise, well, Japan can play an important role. So this is not because of the increased threat of China, but because the necessity of engaging in international cooperation. Japanese government or Prime Minister Abe needs the necessity of changing constitutional interpretations. And well, on the other hand, there is a widespread myth about the Japanese remilitarism. Some people worry about the revival of Japanese militarism, but well, recently, David Welch, a professor at Waterloo University, wrote an article to the Asahi Shimbun in Japan, in which he said that after traveling over many countries in the world, Japan is the most peaceful country except for Iceland. Maybe this would be an ordinary understanding about Japanese position, and you can see the defense spending, and Japan is the lowest, and compared to other countries like these. Last 11 years, Japanese government has been reducing its defense budget. And for the first time last year, Japanese government decided to increase its defense budget by 0.8%. This was largely because of the devaluation of Japanese yen. It is now more costly than before to purchase some of the equipment from overseas. But that's why Japanese government decided to increase the defense budget. But on the other hand, last 10 years or 20 years, Chinese government has been increasing its defense budget by two digits. So well, if you can compare Japan with China, you can easily understand that the size of Japanese defense budget is quite small. And Chinese defense budget is now 4 times bigger than Japanese budget. So it would be difficult to say that Japan is becoming a dangerous militaristic country. So as a conclusion, I'd just like to say that, well, the 2 important goals of Prime Minister Abe is, as I said, one, first, to revitalize Japanese economy. This is an important goal. The secondly, to play a larger role to bring peace and stability in the Asia-Pacific with the cooperation with other like-minded countries, Australia, India, ASEAN, and Korea, of course, in the United States. And Prime Minister Abe believes that this can help to bring peace in the region. So, well, both China and Japan should not damage the peace in the region. And of course, Japan should never damage the regional peace. This should be an important goal for Prime Minister Abe. And within the advisory panels, I have been repeatedly asked Prime Minister Abe to internationalize Japanese foreign policy, security policy, and also to make Japan a much more peaceful and cooperative player in international community. Thank you very much. This is what I want to say.
Thank you very much, Yuichi, for kicking us off so nicely. I'm sure there are lots of comments and questions that we, in the panel, of course, we have a lot of comments on some of the issues also. But of course, you've already given us the answer already. The changes that have been taking place on Japan's foreign policy agenda have been gradual and have been putting Japan into a position of being a stabilizing country as opposed to being an aggressive, non-stabilizing country as it is being accused of sometimes in the neighborhood. Lots of food for thought. We move over to Paul, 50 minutes, with a slightly different take on, or different content of your presentation. When you say, when you ask the question, do changing in government party lead to changes in foreign policy? And of course, then you refer to the changes, or the recent changes, I suppose, in this case, when Japan was governed by the Democratic Party of Japan in 2009, 2012, and then again, power went back to the Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, in 2012, which of course we are all aware of, that Japan has been ruled by essentially one party, by the LDP, for 55 years without any real interruption.
Can I speak over there?
Sure. 50 minutes also, and then
Well, thank you, Axel, for that very kind introduction. So, as you said, the question I'm asking here is, do changes in party lead to changes in foreign policy? Japan is a very good place to examine that because, as just said, there have been very few changes in the ruling party in Japan. We had one briefly in 1993-94 when the LDP split. And then for the first time, perhaps even in modern Japanese history, voters actually voted out the ruling party and voted in a new ruling party in 2003. And they liked this so much, they did it again in 2012. And I should say I have 15 slides, and I have story of my life, too many slides, too little time. I'll try to get through them as quickly as I can. So that's essentially the question. Let's see here. Let's see here. Which button do I have to? This one. Whoops. Sorry. Oh, that, okay, I just didn't have it on. Okay. No? Okay, maybe you can I'll just point. Next slide, please. So just as kind of the outline, I'm looking at three different, okay. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to take a look at three different hypotheses for explaining how the change in governing party affects foreign policy. One is party position hypothesis. Well, you can see those three there. Then I'm going to go look at a couple of cases in Japanese foreign policy over a couple of years. And then finally, I'm going to give some ideas provide some tentative hypotheses for the conditions under which these three hypotheses have the most explanatory value. And please note, this is very much research in progress, so these results are very tentative. I'm still really working on these results. Okay, and so first of all, the party position hypothesis. It's a very straightforward argument. It basically says when an opposition party wins power, foreign policy changes in ways that reflect that party's ideology and its election platform, or the manifesto, as you call it in Japan. So when the Democratic Party of Japan won in 2009, took power, replaced the Liberal Democratic Party, we would expect that foreign policy would change based upon that party's election manifesto and its basic ideological predilections. This kind of reflects straightforward pluralist logic and assumes that public opinion is influential and has an impact through inter-party competition and election manifestos on policy. And of course, elites who ignore the will of the public risk being voted out of office. Now, the continuity hypothesis, on the other hand, would say, even if we change the party in power, not much is going to change. for a couple of reasons. First, according to this view, public opinion is kind of incoherent, unstable, and subject to manipulation, and therefore can be ignored. Politicians don't really have to listen to public opinion. And also you have domestic foreign policy institutions, such as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Ministry of Defense, that have their own policies, have their own expertise, and tend to prevail on politicians. So in effect, it's the old debate in Japanese politics. Do politicians rule or do bureaucrats rule? And according to this view, maybe bureaucrats actually do have more influence. Also, pressure from foreign allies and adversaries, so China, the US, and others, and more general, the structure of the international system, international norms, but also the distribution of power can impact, can cause foreign policy not to change even when the party in power changes. Seems to be working now. Okay, the politics of opposites is a bit more complicated. It argues that once a party takes power, it faces pressure from the electorate to move in the exact opposite direction of its own ideological predilection. This was developed in the 1980s and 1970s regarding American foreign policy, particularly Miroslav Ninich. He applied this to US Soviet policy, and he found that a dove like Jimmy Carter became a hawk to placate public opinion, whereas Ronald Reagan, his successor, who came into office as a hawk, became a dove in order, again, to placate public opinion. So the public distrusted Jimmy Carter and thought he was too weak in his foreign policy. That forced him to move in a more hawkish direction. They thought Reagan was too hawkish. That forced him to move in a more dovish direction. That's the basic logic of this kind of politics of opposites, and it reflects a basic ambivalence on the part of the public, right? They want a foreign policy that is firm and defends national interests, but isn't too warlike, isn't too confrontational, and it plays out through this dynamic. So in terms of cases, I look at the Futenma Air Base relocation. This was a U.S. Marine Air Base that's still in Futenma in Okinawa, a very crowded area, and a proposal from 2006 to move it to a less crowded area of Okinawa, and the DPJ's proposal to maybe move it outside of Okinawa or outside of Japan. Overseas deployments of the Japanese self-defense forces in support of U.S. military operations, the Senkaku Daoyu Island dispute, South China Sea, and then of course the relaxation on the three principles restricting the export of weapons, and also the deployment of Osprey tilt-rotor aircraft to Okinawa. Now, regarding Futenma, and to go through this rather quickly, again, the DPJ, when it came to power in 2009, had this idea under then Prime Minister Hatoyama of moving this base, abandoning the 2006 agreement with the U.S. and either moving it to moving the base out of Okinawa or even out of Japan. Now, public opinion supported this position. However, the U.S. was very opposed, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Defense implicitly tended to be opposed as well, though they didn't say so officially. So this was an attempt at policy change, and it's an attempt that failed. Part of this just has to do with basic competence. To be, in my personal opinion, Prime Minister Hatoyama had a difficult time managing his cabinet, keeping policy consistent. Policy kept changing repeatedly. But also, more importantly, the U.S. was effectively a veto player, and without the support of the U.S. and without more expert support from the foreign policy bureaucracies, it was hard to implement this change. So this is a case of failed change. Then we have the end of the Maritime Self-Defense Forces refueling mission in the Indian Ocean, which had started on 9/11, right after 9/11, in support of U.S. and allied ships that were somehow involved supposedly in combat operations in Afghanistan. The DPJ had succeeded in suspending the operation in 2007 to early 2008 when they were in the majority in the upper house. But when the DPJ came to power in 2009, Prime Minister Hatoyama promised to end the mission. The public supported this. The foreign policy bureaucracy generally was, I don't think, very supportive of that. But nonetheless, the policy was successful. The LDP opposed ending this mission. It introduced legislation in the Diet to revive the mission, but this effort failed. And interestingly, the LDP and Prime Minister Abe have not attempted to revive this mission since returning to power. And this is despite the fact that, Shinzo Abe and the LDP in 2012 ran on this policy of taking Japan back almost into the past, perhaps, Nihon no Tori Modosu. Nonetheless, on this policy, the LDP has essentially gone along with the DPJ's decision, though they don't say so very loudly. Now, in terms of applying law to the Senkaku Islands, previously the LDP had an unofficial policy of not applying Japanese law to the islands or the waters around it. There's a fishing agreement from the late 90s and the late 70s. And this became evident when you had Chinese activists land on the island and destroy a jinja there in Shinto shrine in 2004. The Koizumi administration deported them but did not charge them, even though they should have been charged under Japanese law. Then in 2010, we have, you are perhaps all familiar with this incident involving a fishing vessel, Chinese fishing vessel that rammed apparently 2 Japanese Coast Guard vessels. And in that case, the DPJ Khan administration decided to apply Japanese law and to prosecute the fishing boat captain. Public opinion supported the change, or this was a very high salience. The bureaucracy didn't actually have a lot of influence on the initial decision because it was made very quickly by members of the cabinet. Although, again, this is a big change from previous policy. But again, an external actor, in this case, heavy pressure from China, helped to persuade the Khan administration to ask the prosecutors to drop the case. Of course, they couldn't not order them to do so. And so this was an attempted policy change failed due to very strong external pressure from China. South China Sea policy. We've had a major escalation in tensions beginning in 2009, which is around the time the Democratic Party of Japan came to power. And the DPJ, particularly beginning in the Khan administration and especially the Noda administrations, took the existing policy framework and expanded it qualitatively and became much more active, expanded the use of the Japanese Coast Guard and economic assistance, ODA, to build up regional coast guards, to build up their surveillance capacity so that they could detect any movements by China, say to seize another island in the South China Sea before China could actually get there. They also had a modest expansion of naval exchanges. Also, Japan, this is unrecognized, had a very big multilateral success in 2012 when the Noda administration persuaded ASEAN to create a new multilateral forum, the East Asian ASEAN Maritime Forum, sometimes known as AMF Plus or EAMF. So this is a maritime forum where the major countries of the region and the ASEAN countries get together to talk about maritime issues. This can be used to discuss the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and other issues that are very salient now. So Noda was successful in changing Japanese policy, but then when we have the change of government again with Prime Minister Abe coming to power, there's attempts to expand Japan's role further, don't really move very far because in effect there are no more opportunities. The existing framework has been used as much as possible. There was some discussion about, we've heard today about Japan reclaiming the right to collective self-defense. My take on this is that this really hasn't happened actually, because the change that was made in July was extremely modest in terms of the way it was written. The Japanese Cabinet Legislative Bureau tends to interpret these legal, applies the most conservative legal interpretation possible. So consequently, despite this change, there's no prospect of Japan playing more of a security role under the new change in the South China Sea, particularly since the enabling legislation has not been enacted and probably won't be until after 2016. Finally, weapons exports and the Osprey deployment. Here, the Noda administration relaxed the ban on weapons exports to countries other than the US for the first time since 1983, essentially. This was a low salience issue, but there was not much public opposition. This did, however, go against the overall policy orientation in the DPJ's election manifesto. Nonetheless, this was a successful change. Similar story with the Osprey deployment to Okinawa. This was a much more highly salient issue. The public opposed it. Nonetheless, this was also a successful policy change. And both tend to support the politics of opposites hypothesis. There was an attempt by Noda to make the DPJ look less dovish and tougher on foreign policy. However, the DPJ in the end did not get much credit for these policies. So here we kind of see the results of these. So the position hypothesis, position-taking hypothesis, continuity opposites, we see the various cases. So you can see the Tenma case tends to support the continuity hypothesis. The MSDF deployment tends to support the party position-taking hypothesis. Senkaku case is pretty mixed, so it's hard to draw a strong conclusion. South China Sea tends to support continuity. And these two tend to support, again, the opposites hypothesis of dynamics of opposites. That said, this is, as I say, still very tentative work. I'm still kind of tinkering and thinking about the results. But here we can see some underlying factors: public opinion, how salient it is in public opinion, vested interests, whether they support or oppose, and the outcome. Vested interest is an extremely wide category that probably conceals more than it reveals, because this would include domestic foreign policy bureaucracies like the Foreign Ministry and the Defense Ministry. It also would include external actors like the United States and China. So when we talk, so for example, in Senkaku, for example, China was extremely opposed. The ministries in Japan were a bit more mixed. So again, that's a bit kind of a wide open category there. But nonetheless, I have some other tentative conclusions. First, the party position-taking hypothesis has greatest explanatory power then for explaining positions when they're supported by public opinion and they do not depend upon the bureaucracy for expertise or upon the approval of external actors, such as the MSDF deployment. The continuity hypothesis best explains policy outcomes when the policy has very low salience, the public just doesn't really care that much about it, and or institutional expertise is required for policy implementation, or when the support, or at least the non-veto of external actors, such as, again, allies, the US, potential adversaries, I don't want to say actual adversaries, such as China, is required for policy change. And again, policy is, the politics of opposite hypothesis then best explains salient policy changes that run counter to the ruling party's position and ideology inclination, and when that inclination is opposed by the public, and I might add also when that party is in trouble politically and is trying to improve its image. So with that, I'll end there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Paul, for this presentation, also sticking to the time, of which we don't have very much. I abuse my role, of course, as a moderator and commentator just to start right away. But I'll be very brief with two brief points. The first point is important because I don't know whether all of you are familiar with the Japanese interpretation of collective self-defense, difesa collettiva. I think it's important to explain a little bit, and both Yuichi and Paul touched upon the issue. When we speak about collective self-defense, this of course is directly related to Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which strictly speaking does not allow Japan to have armed forces. Okay, Japan, Article number 9 says, strictly speaking, and not interpreting it differently, says that Japan is not allowed to have armed forces. Now, Japan is not allowed to have a military, but Japan has a military and is spending $50 billion on its military, which is not allowed to exist even. Okay, so it's a very strong military with a very, very big budget, for a pacifist country. Now, what Prime Minister Abe did in July, or what he was planning to do, because as Paul said, this is going to be a long-term process, is to allow Japanese self-defense forces to execute the right of collective self-defense. What is the right of collective self-defense? It is nothing dramatic. It is simply allowing Japanese soldiers to defend soldiers of other countries when taking part in peacekeeping operations. Okay, until today, the Japanese military or the self-defense forces were not allowed to defend soldiers from other countries when being part of international missions. And the way it was interpreted now is even much stricter, because the coalition partner of the LDP, the Komeito, the originally pacifist country, said to the LDP, we will support the change to the interpretation only if the execution of the right of collective self-defense is limited to the case of the defense of Japanese territory. That means if North Korea, if China today, tomorrow decided to attack Japan with military means, Japanese forces would, in the future, would be allowed to fight alongside American soldiers to defend Japanese territory. That's all. That's all. So we will not see, and although China and South Korea, more China has been accusing Japan of that, saying Japan is executing the right to collective self-defense. Hence, in the future, we will see Japanese soldiers dying in Iraq, Japanese soldiers fighting in Afghanistan, but this is not the case. So hence, the reinterpretation of the Japanese Constitution of Article 9 is very, very modest. It's very gradual, and is, as Paul Mitford pointed out, it is not yet taken place. The implementation, the adoptions of the laws that would have to go alongside that reinterpretation have yet to be implemented. And this is going to be, and I'm sure Paul and Yuichi can comment on this, this is going to be a very long process, potentially. But, you know, this is how democracy works. So it's going to be very gradual changes, at least until now. And what Shinzo Abe announced in July sounds like a big event on Japanese, in the context of Japanese foreign and security policies, but it's on paper and on paper only, because the laws that authorize the soldiers to do what other soldiers in other normal countries do, this can take a long time. The other point I wanted to mention is what Yuichi said in the beginning, and I think this is also very, very important to also give the other side, to provide you with another perspective, the Chinese perspective. When Prime Minister Abe says, you know, we are promoting, or Japan is promoting, you know, an international order based on international norms and rules and regulations that are universally acknowledged. Nothing wrong with this. Very normal, very normal. And Japan is, of course, a democratic country, and Japan is a democratic country is, of course, very well positioned to claim that the order or the international order, the security order, the political order in East Asia must be based on internationally acknowledged rules and norms. Very, very normal, and nothing wrong with this. The issue, of course, it looks very different, of course, from a Chinese perspective, you know, and I'm not speaking for the Chinese here, God forbid. But of course, the perspective from China is that this this portion of ideology, of political rhetoric is, of course, aimed at China. It's part of a containment policy. It's aimed at containing, it's not my position, it's the Chinese position. It's aimed at containing China, because Prime Minister Abe knows very well that China has no intention whatsoever to follow those rules and regulations. What we see now in the East China Sea, what we see, what Paul said in the South China Sea, is the very opposite of this. China is not at all thinking that international rules and norms are relevant to its own foreign and security policies. Hence, the Chinese reaction to Prime Minister Abe's calls for international rules and norms that should rule the order in East Asia is, of course, very predictable, because it is part of a Japanese attempt to join the US to contain China. Question mark. I mean, this is the Chinese perspective, and so it was. I think it was useful to also to try to give also you know, to try to explain what the other side thinks. So much for me. Io mi fermo. Over to Matteo Dian, and let's see what he has to say on both presentations. Also equally short, please, 5 to 6 minutes. Yeah, and then also over to you.
First and foremost, thank you very much for inviting me here. It's really a pleasure to say something on these really enlightening presentations. First thing about what Professor Ozoya said, normally we tend to frame the analysis of Japanese foreign policy in terms of still being a pacifist country or being so-called normal country. I think we have been focusing too much on just that dichotomy alone. And I really appreciated when you said Abe is trying to internationalize Japanese foreign policy, because here it's important to stress the big news, and the big news that Japanese foreign policy is not oriented and based on the alliance alone, but there are many news, and those news are mostly new relationship with India, new relationship with ASEAN, countries like Australia. So maybe it's good to focus the attention on that and focus the attention on the fact that this new Japan as a security provider in the Asia-Pacific region will be much more active in building these sort of partnerships. The other thing is important to stress that eventually Japan might become also a technology provider. And in this sense, the fact that there are less limits to the export of arms is another important aspect. Another big thing, of course, that you mentioned is the partnership with NATO. That is another important and relevant change, not just because NATO is looking east, but also because Japan wants to build new partnerships outside its own region. Said so, one other important thing that I would like to stress, and that is mostly my question, is that how can Japan face the basic problem that every country has today in East Asia, which is the basic separation between the economic and the political security realm. While China is the biggest partner for everyone, is also the biggest concern, if we don't want to use the word threat. So on one side, there is big integration between Japan and China economically, but that is not followed by well, a deep reconciliation in terms of security and politics. Same problem, I would say. The Nye Armitage report of 2012 said also another thing. If Japan wants to remain a first-tier nation, basically a great power, should try to pacify, to reconcile politically both with China and Korea, which is another main issue. And we know that Abe had a few problems on that respect. So that will be my concluding question. Can Japan really lead if it doesn't achieve deeper reconciliation with South Korea, especially? And we know about the problems in that respect. My final very short remark would be for Professor Midford. One thing I will consider are factions. DPJ, as the LDP, have many factions, and we saw that those factions matter a lot in terms of foreign policy. The other thing to consider would be, as you said, the power of the United States, and we saw in 2009, 2010, how much the United States can exercise power and prevent Japan from drifting away from the alliance. The other thing, my final point would be, maybe the important thing, again, is not thinking about Japanese foreign policy in terms of normal or simply pacifist, but the big difference for me has been that the DPJ wanted a closer partnership with China and South Korea, while the internationalization of foreign policy for the LPD has been new relationships with other partners such India and Australia. The basic difference is not normal versus pacifist, but it's rather building partnerships with East Asia or the wider region, Southeast Asia and Australia. That maybe is an important issue as well. Thank you very much.
Matteo.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'll try to be very short. First of all, about Professor Hosoya's presentation. Well, it was so rich that I think that the title alone provides a lot of food for thought. And so I'll start precisely from two of the words that are included in your title, stabilizer and East Asia. You've reminded us at the end of your presentation that one of the major aims of Abe's security policy is building a prosperous and stable order. Now, this is the very same objective that we also find in the often mentioned Nye Armitage report, which claimed precisely this objective for the US-Japan alliance, and it also defined the US-Japan alliance as a force for peace, stability and prosperity. And we also find this argument actually in famous speech that then Foreign Minister Aso Taro held in December 2005, before the first East Asia Summit was convened in Kuala Lumpur. And this is not, as a matter of fact, it's not just declaratory policy, because if we look at the history of East Asia, we will see that stability brought by the US-Japan alliance was a fact. And it was the basis that made the East Asian miracle possible. And it was also the basis, ironically as it might seem, that made China's rise, or China re-rise, possible. So, but now we have, as your presentation has pointed out, major changes in Japan's security, in this security pattern. So we have proactive pacifism, and we also have Japan that does not want any longer to be a free rider. So I was wondering, in your opinion, what will be the implications for East Asian regionalism of these major changes, and in particular for the East Asia Summit, and also the project of an East Asia community. And second, very short point, at the beginning of your presentation, you said that Abe's security policy is often misunderstood because it's basically pragmatic and not ideological. Now, international relations scholars remind us that perception is quite important in international relations. So, of course, I mean, that's Abe's view, that's Abe's strategy. It's about being pragmatic, it's about bringing stability. But what about China's perception, and what about the possibility that these changes deteriorate in the kind of paranoid relations which is peculiar of the dilemma of security? And last very short point, you've talking about like-minded countries as a crucial point of Abe's strategy, and of course you've mentioned South Korea. I have a question that doesn't not only have to do with the history problem that Matteo just mentioned, but also with the history of Japan-South Korea alliance in the field of security. Not coincidentally, this alliance has been defined as a quasi-alliance by Victor Cha, or Japan and South Korea have been defined as virtual allies. So do you see hurdles in this process of strengthening Japan-South Korea relation? And then about Professor Midvo's presentation, I found it illuminating, because I think the debate on Japanese foreign policy has been too often said just in terms of sheer continuity or discontinuity. I was wondering, do you think that decision makers or policy makers have a role in this story? I mean, do you think that the first image of Waltz would change something in your analysis, that things would have been different hadn't we had Koizumi in power in 2001, or Abe in power right now? And also about the role of international structure. To what extent do you think it's relevant to explain changes in parties' politics? I mean, the period, the time span that you've analyzed covers a period where Japan experienced 9/11 and then the triple catastrophe, and also, as we will hear later on, prolonged economic stagnation. So to what extent do you think these factors make a difference in the analysis, in the story? Thank you.
Thank you also, Noemi. I would say we do it like this. We give the speakers now 5 minutes, or 4 minutes to answer all the questions, in detail, of course, and then we open the floor to the public. Okay, over to you. You have more time later on, but we also want to include the audience, because I'm sure there are lots of questions already. Go ahead.
Okay, I know that I can't answer all the questions in detail. This is 4 minutes, but I will try. Well, first of all, thank you very much for really insightful comments, and I think that all the comments you gave me really very relevant. And well, all of the three more or less touched upon the importance of reconciliation between Japan and Korea, particularly, of course, Japan and China also as well, but particularly on historical issues. I know that this is a very important topic, but at the same time, we have to notice, we have to fully remember the fact that Sino-Japanese relations, when we look back last 10 years, the Sino-Japanese relations and also Japan-Korean relations were the best at the time of the first Abe administration, 2006 and 2007. Well, 2006 and 7, Prime Minister Abe was very successful in developing Japan-Korean security cooperation. At the time, Japan-Korean relations are really, really good. At the same time, Sino-Japanese relationship was also very good in 2006 and 7, particularly when Prime Minister Abe visited Beijing in October 2007. On the other hand, Sino-Japanese relations and also Japan-Korean relations were worse at the time of the DPJ government. Even the DPJ government prioritized Asian diplomacy to the US-Japan alliance, even though DPJ government made a really, really great effort to strengthen Japan's friendship with both China and Korea. But the relationships were deteriorated for several reasons. One of the biggest reasons for this is that there was a very big turning point in 2008 at the time of the Lehman shock, financial crisis. After the financial crisis, both Korean government and also Korean leaders and Chinese leaders began to think that both the United States and Japan were no more important countries. Of course, the United States is important, but particularly Japan was no more important major power. Well, Chinese government last November declared a new foreign policy. The Chinese government differentiated two foreign policies. One is new type for major power relationships. This is one thing. On the top level, there is a diplomacy for the new type for major power relationship. On the other hand, at the second level, lower level, there is a neighborhood policy. And Chinese government thinks that China needs a cooperation with major great powers such as United States, EU, and Russia. But on the other hand, because China is strong enough, China can pressure surrounding countries such as the Philippines, Vietnam, ASEAN countries, Korea, and Japan. So these strategies are totally different. China introduced this new foreign policy like this. And interesting enough, Japan belongs to the both cases, the great power and the neighborhood policy. So China has been thinking whether China should negotiate with Japan or just to pressure Japan. So if Japan is strong enough, maybe Chinese government respect the negotiation with Japan. But if Japan is a declining country and weak enough, there is no need for such kind of negotiation. The only thing that China should do is to pressure Japan to a better direction. So Japan should be strong enough to revitalize its negotiation with China. Otherwise, China would have no intention to negotiate with Japan. That's why there is a very good sign after Prime Minister Abe's agenda to revitalize Japanese economy. The very good news is that in November, there will be a possibility to have a summit meeting between Japan and China. So I think that both China and Korea have been neglecting the importance of Japan in its foreign policy agenda. So after 2008, both these two governments, excluding Japan experts, advisors from the leaders, Korean leaders and Chinese leaders, but it is necessary for them to think that the Sino-Japanese relations and also Korean-Japan relations are still important. Then they should look at the importance of these relations. And also, just 1 minute, I also think that Japan is very, it's also Japan's or Japanese leaders' responsibility to solve historical issues. Or Japan should not destroy stability in the region. So historical issues are really complicated, but at the same time, Japan should not damage these friendly relations with neighboring countries. That's why I am against Prime Minister's visit to the Asukuni Shrine, because this would damage the stability in the region.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yuichi. Paul, over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you for some very interesting comments. I found them quite useful. First, to what extent are factions within parties important? In my view, factions have become less important due to the new electoral system that Japan introduced after 1993. Before that time, you had different factions of the LDP competing with each other at election time, and that because you had multi-seat districts where you had more than one LDP candidate running against each other, that tended to encourage factionalism. There's some other causes as well, but that was an important one. Under the new electoral system, that's become less important. Factions matter less, but there are still factions in the LDP, of course, and there are in the DPJ too. But those have tended to be centered around mainstream versus, have tended to group into two kind of poles, the mainstream and anti-mainstream factions. But within those two poles, yes, the shift in power from Obuchi Keizo, the Prime Minister till 2000, via Prime Minister Mori to Prime Minister Koizumi, led to huge policy changes, even though all three of those Prime Ministers were LDP Prime Ministers, that could in some sense be compared to a change in government, a change in the party in power. So in the past, the LDP sometimes played ruling party and opposition party as well. But under the new electoral system, that's a lot harder to do. I also, related to that, I agree that actually individual leaders can make a big difference. So I think certainly Koizumi brought about big change in Japanese foreign policy, and the fact that Abe is in power now instead of, say, another LDP leader like, say, Tanigaki, has had a big impact on Japanese foreign policy. So leaders certainly do matter in the Japanese system. Also in terms of the DPJ, Hatoyama was very different as a prime minister than, say, Prime Minister Khan and Prime Minister Noda. And as for external shocks, do things such as 9/11 or the triple disaster of 3/11 make a difference? Yes, they certainly do. To some extent, they tended to point in opposite directions, however, but they definitely make a difference. I guess I'd like to say a little bit about Sino-Japanese and Japan's relationship with Korea as well. From my perspective, actually, the best it's certainly true that Prime Minister Abe, when he was in power the first time, greatly improved relations over the kind of nadir that they had reached, they'd fallen to under Prime Minister Koizumi. But as I see it, relations were better under former Prime Minister Fukuda Yasuo. That's when we had a peak. And again, under the Hatoyama administration, relations with China and Korea were extremely good. Now, in the case of, and in the beginning of the Khan administration, I think they're pretty good too. Now, it was really that fishing boat incident in September 2010 that led to a very rapid and sharp deterioration in Sino-Japanese relations. Regarding relations with Korea, I tend to have a somewhat different view. The relationship started getting better under the first Prime Minister Abe and continued to get better until about 2012. In fact, the peak in Japanese-Korean relations in recent history, as I can see it, is in 2012, when the two sides come very close to signing their first ever security agreement. Now, the Koreans back out at the last minute because the history issue again resurfaced, and then you have former President Lee becoming the first Korean leader to step foot on the disputed Takeshima-Tokto Islands. But before that, the relationship had been, as I see it, excellent. And regarding kind of the China and what needs to be done to move the relationship forward, in terms of, are the two sides willing to negotiate? One big issue and kind of stumbling block is that Japan is simply not willing to talk about the Senkaku Daoyu issue. Their position is that no territorial dispute exists. Now, some retired diplomats, such as Togo Kazuhiko, for example, have argued that this is a mistake and that Japan should at least stop saying that no territorial dispute exists and be willing to talk about it, rather than saying that none exists. In fact, he's argued this is almost a Soviet-esque policy. The Soviets in the 1970s and 80s continually said there was no territorial dispute with Japan over the northern territories, the so-called Hoporyodo. Eventually, the Soviet Union under Gorbachev and then Russia abandoned that policy. Not that that has done really anything to undermine the Russian claims to the island. So in fact, admitting that a dispute exists, particularly when many third countries, such as the United States, acknowledge that a dispute exists because they take no position on sovereignty. A lot of countries, such as the US, take no position on who has sovereignty over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, which, for example, compared to Okinawa, is not an issue. In that sort of case, I think acknowledging that there is a dispute is the sensible thing to do. In fact, it even gives Japan power over China, because then China will be pushing for negotiations, and Japan can use that as a lever to extract concessions from China, the same way that Russia now uses negotiations over the Northern Territories to extract concessions from Japan. So I think that might be one way in which you could think about kind of jump-starting negotiations between the two sides. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. That, however, maybe it sounds a bit awkward now. I mean, that's of course an open debate. Is that, you know, when we see what China has done over the last 2 years, it has been intruding. It has sent vessels into Japanese-controlled territorial waters around those islands. And if Japan now acknowledged that there were a territorial dispute, which probably is not a bad idea per se, but I fear this could be interpreted as Japan giving in to Chinese pressure, giving in to Chinese, you know, physical pressure of acknowledging a territorial dispute. It is, you know, from a Japanese governance position, probably very, very difficult now to acknowledge that there is a territorial dispute when China over the last 2 years has been with military force trying to convince Japan to acknowledge that there's dispute. Is a, you know, it sounds good on paper, but in reality it's a bit difficult.
I just add one small thing. I am talking about a bargain. So I think if Japan said to China, we will recognize the dispute and then you stop sending ships through, I think China would say yes.
Perfect. Okay, that's an idea. Okay, maybe you can take that home to Prime Minister Abe. I mean, seriously, that is an idea, of course. Yeah. Okay, tocca a voi adesso. Over to you. If you have questions or comments, please identify yourselves and then fire away. No missiles, but only questions. Prego. Anche italiano, come volete. Tedesco. Sì, la signora lì.
My name is Giuseppina Porini. Thanks a lot for the presentation. I'm going to be a little bit provocative, if I may. And we've been hearing about foreign policy in Japan and changing. But Mr. Abe gave a big impulse to that. I'm just wondering, we've been hearing Japan being a stabilizer in Asia for many years. Been hearing this in the 80s, been hearing this in the 90s. Now it's coming back again, and it's coming back in a country where we have 3 arrows. One of them is the growth of Japan, revitalizing it. Foreign policy is one of that. It's just very pragmatic. I do not see much of that because I think it's very difficult to see Japan becoming a stabilizer in a region. And simple reason is that the biggest economy is there, China. And the way in which you have to deal with China is very difficult to cut it out. Professor Osoya showed us the security diamond. I see India, Australia, Japan, and Hawaii Island, which I mean is just US. I see China getting closer and closer to India. So that is very difficult to break through that diamond without taking China into consideration, becoming to be the stabilizer there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your comment. Can we take one more question, Professor Eva? Yes. Just be brief, please, and then because I know you're not brief, but please be brief this time.
Yes.
Okay.
I ask, as a geographer as I am, how is possible to conceive a foreign policy comparing Australia, big country, physically big country with very few population, and India, with a different kind of culture. So foreign relation is also a cultural relation. And I don't think that this kind of diamond idea could be useful and having a practical exit, because India is really different from Australia and also from USA.
Ok, grazie. Ok, any more questions? Altre domande per adesso? Sì, prego.
Very short, very small comment. Yeah, my name is Carlo Addis. Professor Hosoya just said that he doesn't support the decision of Prime Minister Abe to visit Yasukuni Shrine. And in fact, he never did during the 2006 and 2007. How he sees this change? Why? I mean, it's part of a kind of a strategy, or it fits in some special thing. I mean, Mr. Abe did, when he was Prime Minister the first time, he didn't visit the shrine, but he made the point to visit the shrine this time. Is any, how he personally can explain this, even if Professor Hosoye just mentioned that he doesn't support this behavior of Mr. Abe.
Thank you, grazie.
It's just one.
Ok. Altre domande per adesso? Altrimenti, can I ask both speakers to address the points, all of the points, if you think that's possible? Can we start with Yuichi and then go on to Paul? Is that okay? Yeah, Yuichi.
Thank you very much for very important questions. The last question about Prime Minister Abe's visit to the Yasukuni Shrine. Why did he visit the Yasukuni Shrine last December, even though he didn't visit the Yasukuni Shrine in his first administration, as you said? My understanding is like this. Well, in the first Abe's administration, just a few months before he became Prime Minister, a Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs, Shotaro Yachi, now he's a close advisor to Prime Minister Abe and also at the top post at National Security Council. He visited Beijing repeatedly and he talked with Chinese counterpart and particularly State Secretary Dai Bingguo. And then it was reported, and I heard that they basically agreed on a package deal. While Prime Minister Abe would not visit the Yasukuni Shrine, on the other hand, China should respect mutual beneficial relationships based on common strategic interests. It means that China and Japan should jointly collaborate in exploiting natural resources in East China Sea. They can avoid conflict with that. And then, on the other hand, Japan should respect Chinese request that Japanese Prime Minister would not visit the Yasukuni Shrine. And repeatedly, when Prime Minister Shinzo Abe became Prime Minister for the second time, December 2012, after that, repeatedly Prime Minister Abe told to Chinese government that we should come back to the basic point of that agreement. He said, he didn't say the package deal, but he said that we should come back to the point of the mutual beneficial relationships based on common strategic interests. But Chinese government repeatedly betrayed and denied it by unilaterally exploit natural resources in the East China Sea, denying that joint declaration between Japan and China. And Japanese government, Prime Minister Abe repeatedly criticized Chinese behavior, unilateral behavior in East China Sea because this betrayed the joint declaration. But repeatedly, Chinese government denied it. So, well, even though Prime Minister Abe didn't visit the Yasukuni Shrine in October last year, but he thought that the package deal was no more effective. This is my personal understanding. I didn't hear from Prime Minister Abe, but my understanding is that because China betrayed and denied that package deal, it was no more effective for Japanese Prime Minister as well to respect that deal. So I think that this behavior, I mean, Prime Minister Abe's visit to the Yasukuni Shrine last December was more or less a counterattack against China on that point. And if Chinese government can come back to the point of the mutual beneficial relationships based on common strategic interest. I think that there is no necessity for Prime Minister Abe to visit the ASEAN country again. So that's why I think that China can come back to some point of that deal. I mean, the joint declaration. That's why I think that Prime Minister Abe will not visit the ASEAN country again. And this will be a very good for the future of the Sino-Japanese relations. Thank you.
Paul?
Okay. I guess I'd like to kind of pick up on this point about can Japan become a stabilizing factor for East Asia? Is it possible? And I think my response would be not only can it already is, and it has been for decades. You've had, Japan has been very stable itself. It's hosted U.S. military bases. It's supported the U.S. to the extent you believe that the U.S. helps to maintain stability in East Asia. Japan has been an indispensable partner to that, not only bases, but again, the financial support. Japan, we have these territorial disputes over, frankly, pieces of territory that from the outside look like just barren rocks, Takeshima, Tokdo, Senkaku Daoyu. Northern territories, that's a more substantive territorial dispute. But those not aside, Japan has, maintained a very peaceful disposition towards its neighboring countries. So Japan has been and remains a crucial stabilizing factor in East Asia. So the question is, how much, if anything, needs to change to maintain that moving forward? Of course, Japanese leaders themselves have talked about the southern Ryukyu Islands near the Senkakus, the so-called Sekishima Islands, such as Yonaguni, etc., Miyakojima, as being effectively a security vacuum, and they might see that as a local source of instability. Japan has been moving to change that. They're establishing their first military base on Yonaguni. So that might help to deal with any small kind of local instability that might result from Japan not having military forces down there. But essentially, Japan always has been a stabilizing factor. I don't really have too many insights about why Prime Minister Abe decided to visit Yasukuni this time. Perhaps he simply decided that not doing so the last time didn't really produce any positive benefits. I think what Hosoya Sensei said about negotiations that fell apart it sounds like a very plausible explanation to me. I should add that there have been negotiations going on for some kind of deal that might involve, again, Japan recognizing that there is a territorial dispute. Under Prime Minister Noda, there was the so-called Wuhan talks in the central city of China. And I've heard Chinese interlocutors say they have blamed Japan because they leaked it to apparently they claim the Japanese side leaked it to the press. I don't know about that, but certainly there have been some ongoing negotiations for a long time, which is a source of optimism. To be optimistic, it's also a source of pessimism in the sense that they keep breaking down for various reasons. So we can hope that they're able to come up with a kind of pragmatic package that can lead to something like the restoration of the status quo ante before September 2012, in which China doesn't send ships through, and Japan, going back further to the early 90s, does at least stop saying there is no territorial dispute, recognizes there is. Incidentally, again, I would just emphasize that there's simply, I would argue that if you look in international politics, there's simply no basis for claiming that if a country recognizes a territorial dispute, it then loses the territory. It's just, there's just no connection between those two. Regardless of some of the other things that may be going on around it.
Thank you very much, Paul. Yes, and if I may also use my position, also what you said on, also confirming a little bit, well, not a little bit, but very strongly what Paul and you just been saying. I mean, Japan is, of course, has been a stabilizing country, not only in Asia, but in China in particular, the country that supported and financed Chinese economic reforms and growth in the 1980s and 1990s up until 2008 is Japan. Japan until 2008, until the Olympic Games in Beijing, was paying $1 billion per year in development aid to China. And so China has been a huge important stabilizing factor. And of course, the second point you raised, does it make sense? Is it beneficial to cut out China out of the process? China feels isolated. But I think, and I don't want to sound too journalistic, but I think China is doing a very good job cutting out itself very effectively, because when you look at the policies, when you look at the territorial policies in particular, not only with Japan, but also in Southeast Asia, Chinese policies have been very effective in isolating China. It has made the return to the US, the pivot to Asia, the US pivot to Asia, very easy to explain to the public, because Chinese policies have been so aggressive and so assertive that China has been cutting out itself very effectively, and that's important maybe, and that's not me talking, but there is a group of scholars in China who say just that to the government, said, look, we disagree with Japan on many things, on history and everything, and Japan is a bad country, but our territorial disputes have been a complete mess because we have been cutting out ourselves very effectively. This may not be a mainstream opinion, and there are many opinions, but I think this is the people that is interesting to listen to. La prossima volta, non adesso, perché we are finished, abbiamo finito. Grazie mille a voi. Thank you very much to all of you. And non andate via, non c'è una pausa adesso, non andate via, chiudiamo le porte perché c'è una seconda sessione sull'economia giapponese. Ancora grazie mille a voi e andiamo avanti. We go ahead right away with the second session. Again, thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Nice.
Dopo tutto.
Nessuno era posto del poveraccio perché l'Australia
è troppo piccola. Io qui? Sì. Allora, guardo. Allora manca una sedia.
Resto vicino. Caldino qua dentro, devo dire.
Sì,
no?
è vero. I microfoni sono on.
Allora, a quanto pare tira un po' di meno l'economia. Questo è di sì? Sì, non sapevo che c'era una io non so. Ho mandato prima un articolo che forse ho mandato. Grazie. Quando è uscito questo? È uscito il 14 settembre, professore.
Grazie. Grazie.
Te lo lascio.
Me lo puoi? Ti chiederò poi una...
Quando hai letto l'ultimo capitolo. volevo farti vedere, questo è quello di oggi.
Ah,
Se tu
ecco.
guardi qui ci sono i
Sì, sì,
cartine
sì.
direi dei vari paesi.
Esatto.
Perché
E anche l'Italia sta invecchiando. You shall have 50 minutes, you know. But, penso che possiamo iniziare. Okay. Good afternoon to everybody. I would like to begin the second session. The second session, as you know, is about economics, and apparently economics is really a dismal science because some of the audience were afraid to listen to negative views and left. My job as a chairperson will be very easy on the one end, meaning that I will introduce very quickly our speakers and the discussants because of time constraints. And being economists, we have to use at the best level of productivity every minute of our time. So I would like to give immediately the floor to Professor Plummer. Professor Plummer actually is an old friend we've been knowing for many years, I would say decades, and presently Professor Plummer is a professor at the campus in Bologna of Johns Hopkins University. And he will speak exactly about one very relevant aspect of the economic recovery, meaning the Trans-Pacific partnership between many countries over the two sides of the Pacific. And I understand, but it is politics, not economics, that this partnership is meant also to a bit contain China, to have some sort of alliance that would counterbalance Chinese expansionism. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I do have some PowerPoint slides that I could also do without, but okay. Okay. Is it okay if I go up to the podium there? Okay, I'll just do it here. It's fine. Okay. So, Mr. Chair, as you mentioned, my task is to consider the economics of Japan's participation in the ongoing integration in the Asia-Pacific region via closer economic cooperation, in particular things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but also the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. These new cooperative fora, if you will, these negotiating fora, have been deemed given a new term called mega-regionalism. And I think this mega-regionalism also is something that has touched Europe as we look at the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership. So we have these three very large regional agreements, something very new, and that dominating international trade. So what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about what's going on in the Asia-Pacific region from that point of view, and Japan in the region itself, as well as looking at some of the economic effects of Japan's participation in mega-regionalism, both for Japan as well as for the EU. And also I want to bring this a bit home to the EU as well, because I think this is also a challenge to us here in Europe. Okay, so what I'd like to do in doing this is present some some estimates we have of the actual effects we should expect to see on these economies using both a general equilibrium model and a partial equilibrium model. So, okay, I think it'd be useful to start thinking about the context of the multilateral trading system, the Doha Development Agenda, that has been so important for growth and development globally, including in the Asia-Pacific region. But I think it's important to underscore the fact that we're having some difficulties moving forward in the WTO, not in terms of necessarily rule enforcement and such, which is doing very well, but in terms of pushing forward liberalization at the multilateral level. In December of 2008, it's when we hit a big block. December 2011, we hit a big block in terms of moving forward in the new liberalization package, which was called the Doha Development Agenda. And 2 years later, in December 2013, it came to a conclusion, and what was negotiated was something called the Bali mini package, because the negotiations were at Bali, which had 3 features, including trade facilitation and food subsidies. But this package hasn't even been forthcoming. Small as it was compared to what the ambitions were, it still hasn't gone through. And it was supposed to at the end of July, and negotiations are taking place. So even the small part of that multilateral agenda is proving extremely difficult to push forward at the WTO. So even though a multilateral approach might be the best way to face it, it has been very disappointing that we haven't been able to push this through. I don't have that much time to talk about why this is the case, but I might point out that usually we're reading the paper these traditional arguments that it's a North-South split. The North has its interests, the South has its interests, they fight for different things, and that's where the block is. The South has now become stronger, and so this is a sign of maturity. And there may be some truth to that, but this is what happens in negotiations, right? The developed countries will be looking at services and intellectual property and perhaps advanced products in terms of trade. And the South would do more, would look at agriculture and labor-intensive goods. That's all normal, okay? So we have this. But there's an additional element that is often not appreciated, and that is the conflict within the South. Because it's not just India protesting against what the United States wants, it's Brazil being nervous about what China wants to get. If Brazil opens up its markets more in the WTO context, it's opening up to China, and it already has what it considers to be an unbalanced relationship with China. So this is a problem. And I think we've seen that also in evidence. However, but regardless of what argument dominates, they both would suggest that it's going to be a great deal of time before we see a single undertaking under the Doha Development Agenda that is sufficiently ambitious for the 21st century, that is going to be consistent with what the private sector is demanding these days. Okay, so what we're seeing is the private sector, the market, is demanding new strategies, and I think that this regionalism trend is manifesting itself in Asian regionalism. We all know that it's better to do things at the multilateral level. However, there is also an argument to do it in a smaller group of countries. And in the past, it has been more the bilateral level we've seen. Now, this is a relatively new phenomenon, you got to say. In Asia, really, as we'll see in a moment, these agreements really shot up this century, right? Just over the last 15 years, it's shot up. However, they tend to be bilateral by nature because it's much easier to do. You only have to deal with interests of 2 countries. And so that's what's resulted. However, this is a very inefficient strategy in the sense that in the case of Asia, as many of you know, the big goal of the market, if you will, is to facilitate a more efficient regional division of labor, in particular boosting regional production networks, which have been the main driver of economic integration in the Asia-Pacific region. That's been a big push. And if that's the case, if what you really need to do is facilitate these regional production networks, which have a very positive potential for not just developed, middle income, but also least developed countries, then bilateral free trade areas won't do it. You need to have regional ones. And I think this is an important push behind this process. Now, Europe has always been a major player in regionalism, but it has not been particularly active in Asia until very recently. Asia itself has been reticent, and I mentioned didn't have much earlier on, but recently has become an enthusiastic convert. And I think it's interesting to consider Japan in this context, because Japan always was multilateralist in its approach. It has an extremely liberal manufacturing sector. It's got the lowest tariffs in the world, essentially, of any big country. Average tariffs of about 1.7% on manufacturers. However, it's always had problems on the agricultural side. And this has always made it hesitant to participate very actively at the WTO, and made it difficult to participate actively in bilateral free trade areas. The classic story is when Japan sat down for one of its first agreements with Singapore. And during those negotiations, you would think it would be very easy to do an agreement between Japan and Singapore, both advanced countries. Agriculture shouldn't be a big deal. Singapore is a city-state, right, without much of an agricultural sector. And yet for 3 months, those negotiations were held up because of agriculture. Precisely goldfish held it up. And that seems strange. You have these very important countries held up by goldfish, but of course the goldfish were outside of Okinawa, and the political pressures were such not to do anything. So Japan has had a very difficult time moving forward in what would be significant free trade areas, but it has seen it in its interest in order to move forward. It's had to. In part, China, which has been much more ambitious, has prodded Japan to move in this direction. And I think that what we're seeing here is Japan felt a necessity to begin to participate in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP negotiations, in part because it felt as though it had to. It risked being isolated if not. And in that participation, it has, it joined in July of 2013 in the TPP. And with the goal, the United States said it had a goal of finishing those negotiations by October 2013, which, looking back at it, was actually quite laughable, that you thought you could bring the third biggest economy in the world with its own intractable political problems and yet do a deal in a couple of months. And we see that really what seems to be holding it up to some degree is this problem with Japan in terms of agriculture and to some degree automobiles, but it's especially on the agricultural side. So Japan is finding it's very much in its interest to participate in this process from a political, arguably a strategic, and an economic perspective, but it has its old ghosts to deal with, particularly in agriculture. When I was at the OECD, we did a lot of studies on the Japanese agricultural sector, and it became very clear that what's in place, we don't have time to go into this much, but what's in place in Japan in terms of the agricultural sector is something that is so rigid that areas in which Japan has comparative advantage in agriculture cannot grow. And so this is actually itself stifling growth in the agricultural sector in Japan. And secondly, the average age of a farmer in Japan is 66 years old. Now, the typical Japanese person lives to be very old, among the oldest in the world. That's great. But normally at 66, we'd expect we'd be thinking about retirement, not farming, particularly when the retirement age in Japan for the government is 60 years old. So I guess what one does is one works for the Ministry of Finance and then goes to work in the countryside. Doesn't make much sense to me. But in any event, this has become a very important political problem in context. Now, just to give you an idea of what these agreements look like, we've got here through 2013 these Asia-Pacific trade agreements. In the red, we've got agreements which are in the Asian area, and the blue ones are trans-Pacific, that is between countries on either side of the Pacific Rim. And you could see very clearly that, you know, essentially before 1992, we didn't have any significant free trade areas. It wasn't until ASEAN had one in 1992 that it became important. As we hit 2000, we see this nonlinearity of a very large increase, both in terms of intra-Asian agreements as well as trans-Pacific agreements. Okay. Now, talking about the economics of this, let me work through here because I know I'm very cognizant of the problems of time. I'd like to give a few empirical examples about what this means. What does this Asia-Pacific integration mean for Japan and the EU using a computable general equilibrium model that we have. And so these results are based on some work I've done with Peter Petri and Fan Zai in order to give some truth in advertisement. I should say that Peter and I did write a few articles in the Nikkei and in Newsweek Japan supporting strongly Japanese participation in the Trans-Pacific Partnership because we thought this was very much in Japan's interests. Okay, I'm going to focus now on the TPP, but also this regional comprehensive economic partnership is important, yet it's a long way off. And my view is that if TPP goes through, you'll see the RCEP begin to be taken seriously, and you'll also see TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership, become taken seriously. I don't have that much time to go into this model. We've got a web page where we, have all of our simulations and the model itself. I just want to mention that we've got diverse sectors, 18 sectors in 24 regions. And what we do is we do our calculations based on a complicated baseline in which we include all of the regional agreements that have already taken place. So in other words, and that took a long time to do. In other words, the Korean-US free trade area, for example, had been negotiated but not implemented by 2010, which is our base year. Well, we don't want to get the effects of the US-Korea agreement from the TPP if it's already been done. So what we want to know is what would be the marginal value added or value subtracted of the TPP. So what we do is we implement that agreement within the baseline so that all of our results that we get are considered relative to this baseline, and we're able to look at it on an annual basis to see what happens over time. Okay, and if you look at the results from this model, here's a summary of, if you look at Japan in the TPP 12, we see that the increase in Japanese GDP is about 2%, $105 billion. And $105 billion is fairly significant in these models, frankly. It's much bigger than what you'd expect. You certainly would get on any scenario that Japan would have been in under the World Trade Organization Doha Development Agenda. So it's fairly large. And it's what we see for Europe, for example, is you get a negative effect, but it's not a very large negative effect. It's about $4 billion. And I'm going to mention later that's a bit deceiving. But what we end up seeing is Japan in this arrangement does have a big boost to its GDP. And I would put to you that, oh my gosh, I haven't put that through. I would put to you that this is very significant in the context of a country that has had such disappointing economic growth over the past 2 decades. 2% is growth. It's not based on monetary policy. It's not based on fiscal policy. It is something that is a non-debt creating stimulus, which is important. Secondly, I think from the Japanese point of view, which is critical, is that we keep in mind that Abe-san had 3 arrows. One is fiscal policy, heavily constrained by that huge debt overhang of about 245%, as well as the consumption tax, which was blamed on the most recent quarter's big drop. So fiscal policy is sort of handicapped. Monetary policy has been placed as one of these arrows as well, to increase the target from 1% to 2% in terms of inflation, which makes one think, because even before that we couldn't hit 1%. So why put it up to 2%? But anyway, the idea of having this QQE approach to increase liquidity has had the effect of dropping the value of the yen, and did have some external effect, but relatively limited, and seems to be petering out to some degree. The big arrow that is important is the third one, on structural reform. And the TPP could lead to, because of its depth and its sophistication, because it's supposed to be a 21st century arrangement which covers a lot of different areas, many of which Japan could use to in order to become more competitive, could be very important as a leading push in terms of these structural reforms in the Japanese market. Okay, now I will, since I only have 1 minute left, I will skip for the moment the effects on the EU. I just want to mention that you saw, I pointed out some small effects on the EU in terms of the general equilibrium, but I think it's very important to understand that these models are very aggregate, and they're looking at a $18 trillion economy that is very complicated. And we would never expect to see big effects in all sectors, but they could have big effects in certain sectors. So if you look at it, not in this black box of a general equilibrium model, but specifically at a disaggregated approach, we've come to the conclusion, if you look at it, you do see certain sectors that are quite negatively affected by Asian integration if Europe is outside of it. In particular, things like automobiles, aircraft, some of these sophisticated areas, places where we think are growing, have great growth potential in Asia, in Europe, could be negatively affected, particularly in the Chinese market. Not so much in the Japanese market, but in the Chinese market. So that's important from a European point of view. Okay. So since I had just 1 minute, I will conclude on those remarks. So thank you very much.
Thanks to Michael for putting Japan economic problems in this international perspective. And as I already explained, because of the time, I will give immediately the floor to Adam Slater, a senior economist from Oxford Economics, a relevant, very relevant research center in Oxford. Please. Are you going? Yeah.
Perhaps a little higher for me. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to put together a presentation here which focuses very much on the hard economics of what has become known as the Arbonomics phenomenon, and specifically whether or not this attempt by the government of Japan to revitalize its economy is heading for some difficulties. Arbonomics is a journalistic term, I suppose. Originally, it's come to be understood as comprising of 3 arrows after a Japanese proverb. The first of these is strong monetary easing and the 2% inflation target. The idea there is to lift Japan out of what has been a lengthy period of price deflation, which is considered to have had many deleterious effects on the economy, not least making the fiscal situation far worse. The second original part of Arbonomics was a short-term fiscal expansion, which has now run its course and is in fact giving way to the opposite policy, a policy of fiscal retrenchment, as I shall come on to. And the third arrow, as mentioned just now by my co-speaker, is structural reforms. The first 2 arrows were aimed at lifting Japan out of deflation, giving growth and inflation an upward shock, very much a short-term policy. And the third arrow aimed at revitalizing Japan's economy from the supply side by fostering a stronger long-term growth rate. So I'm going to now go through how we at Oxford Economics believe Japan is progressing in these various areas. First of all, on inflation, I think our conclusion here would be that the situation is somewhat mixed at the moment. Japan has succeeded in moving from a situation of deflation to positive inflation, but progress is not as impressive as it appears, because inflation has been increased by short-term factors, in particular the consumption tax increase in April, adding 2 percentage points on its own, and also the depreciation of the yen from late 2012, although that effect is starting to wane now. In terms of meeting the 2% inflation target on a more sustained, longer-term basis, we are concerned that the Bank of Japan is falling short. In particular, we note that inflation expectations, long-term inflation expectations, are falling below 2%, and that wage growth remains very weak. And the charts on the next slide will illustrate my point. In particular, note the chart on the left, which shows headline inflation, the red line, core inflation in the red line, and our estimate of core inflation excluding the consumption tax rise, the blue line, heading back towards zero after having risen a little bit. So a matter of some concern for us. And on the right, my point about inflation expectations is illustrated. Moving on to the issue of corporate behavior, which we think is extremely important for Japan. In our view, one of the big problems Japan has had is that deflationary expectations became entrenched in the corporate sector, not so much the household sector, more the corporate sector. And this led to a very defensive mentality in the corporate sector, prioritizing accumulation of financial assets, reduction of debt, and deprioritizing things like investment, increased wages. In terms of progress so far, we see from the very latest data just perhaps a glimmer of hope. The large corporate financial surplus that Japanese companies have been running starting to narrow a little bit. But once again, we'd say the overall picture is mixed. Some of the surveys of the corporate sector still suggesting that corporates are very wary about raising prices. And once again, the next slide will illustrate those 2 points. The corporate financial balance being the blue bars on the left-hand side. You can see it's been consistently very high, but just starting to narrow very much now. And on the right-hand side, surveys of price expectations among large firms, which have just moved into positive territory, but it is unclear whether they shall remain there. Economic growth. 2013, we would say, was a relatively successful year. The stimulus policies managed to bring growth up to 1.5% versus a trend estimate of 1%. And there was also some strong growth before the implementation of the first consumption tax increase this year. However, there's been a slump thereafter, and the indicators for Q3 are not promising. And with the stock market boom also coming to an end, Oxford Economics is quite downbeat, in fact, about the short-term growth outlook for Japan now. We expect GDP to grow about 0.7% this year, about 0.9% next year. And essentially this means growth around about trend. So not much really to say in terms of a bonus from the Abenomics package beyond 1 year, it seems. And once again, the next slide illustrates those points. A big risk now coming for Japan is that another round of fiscal tightening is planned for next year, a second large rise in the consumption tax. The current growth indicators do not suggest that the economy is in a very robust position to absorb this. We think there is a risk that, in fact, such a second rise, unless the economy picks up substantially in the meantime, could push Japan back into very weak growth and possibly even recession. And this would in turn rekindle, I think, a lot of the concerns there are about Japan's fiscal position, which were again alluded to by my co-speaker, very high public debt and still a very wide fiscal deficit. So in our view, Japan has essentially got its policy sequencing wrong. In our view, it would have made sense to have delayed the increases in the consumption tax until such a time as the economy was in a more robust state to manage them. And there must now be a serious question as to whether the second consumption tax rise will go ahead. And I think if it is cancelled, that will probably be quite an important symbolic event. It will probably be rather a negative sign for how well this program has been proceeding. I'll come on to structural reform now. The supposed aim of the third arrow policies was to bring the potential growth rate up to 2% per annum, which was always extremely optimistic. Given the negative demographics in Japan, this would require a surge in productivity growth. But I'm afraid to say that from our perspective, there have been rather few radical measures to date, mostly piecemeal, small-scale stuff. There are some areas where Japan could, I think, make a big difference. Apart from the trade liberalization already mentioned by my co-speaker, we would identify female participation in the labor market as a real opportunity area, which is very low at the present time, and also tackling some of the inefficient and protected sectors in the economy which have low productivity. I think that also includes some manufacturing sectors in a sense, in which case we would here refer to the very low FDI flows that Japan has had over the last few decades, a kind of form of covert protectionism, I think. The next slide shows those points once again. You can see Japan's female participation rate, the red bar on the left-hand chart, right down towards the bottom of the OECD table, at just 48%. And on the right, you can see some of the big productivity gaps there are between sectors in Japan. In particular, as mentioned before, agriculture is a very low productivity sector. However, we would not emphasize that too much because agriculture is also a very, very small sector in Japan. I think much more an area of concern for us would be areas like wholesale, retail, and some of the lagging manufacturing sectors, which were once productivity leaders and which are probably not anymore, for example, electrical machinery. And finally, just the long-term aspects of this, which I think are really the important part in the context of this overall conference. Without a revitalized economy, can Japan put a big enough footprint on the world stage? Quite possibly not. What are the prospects for the medium long term in the Japanese economy which will inform this? Well, as we mentioned, Japan must, if it's even to maintain its relatively low growth rate of the last couple of decades, achieve quite strong productivity growth in the future. It cannot do that, in our view, without a real acceleration of structural reforms. Our forecast for potential growth in Japan is quite low, less than 1% a year. If that is realized, it means that Japan's position in the world economy will continue to decline, and it has already declined a long way. In 1990, Japan accounted for 12% of world GDP. It's now 8%. By 2030, based on our forecast, it'll be 5.5%. That'll be a quarter of the US share, and it'll be a third of China's share. And that may really illuminate the issue that Hosoya-san mentioned, I think, about China perhaps not taking Japan very seriously in that kind of context. Japan, on a GDP per head basis, will do a little better. We forecast 1.5% growth from 2014 to 30. So for the ordinary man in the street, it may not look too bad. But we would note that this is well below the rate we forecast in the United States. So based on our forecast at the moment, what Japan faces is, to use an English expression, genteel decline, continuing as it has done perhaps for the last 20 years. And overall, I think we'd have to conclude by saying that Abenomics is a very mixed bag. It has had some short-term successes, but I think in its really major challenge, the possibility of driving up Japan's long-term growth rate, it has fallen significantly short of where we might have hoped for. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank Dr. Slater for the very concise but very clear presentation of Abenomics and the prospect for the future. Now we have 4 distinguished discussants, at least about 3. I'm sure they are distinguished and they know very well the Japanese situation. They will comment on different aspects of the economic situation, the present economic situation, and the future prospect of Japan. And I would like to give the floor to Professor Volpi. He is very, very knowledgeable of Japan, having lived for decades over there and having taught in Japanese university, written many books, and of course worked in Japan. So thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to take another spin in looking at the situation in Japan, the Abenomics, the economy. And I would remind everybody that it is not appropriate just to speak about economy when you address countries like Japan, but you have to go through the culture, which is very different from other countries. You know, just imagine a series of islands which have been isolated from the world for 3,000 years. Of course, they have developed a unique culture, and unfortunately, they believe strongly it is a unique culture, and that's the problem. When the Japanese problem started, in my opinion, it started with the globalization. Professor Thomas Friedman has defined the globalization as a gold dress, which, you know, is golden, but at the same time is very stretched. You cannot move. Why you cannot move? You cannot move because it requires level field, playing field approach, meaning you have to open up your economy, and you have to internationalize your economy, and you have to let others do in your market what you want to do in other markets. And I believe this is and will continue to be a very major problem for Japan. Professor Plummer spoke to you about TPP, and in TPP, one of the biggest problems which surface is immediately the issue of agriculture. Why agriculture is a problem in Japan? Because people think that the rice you buy from Thailand is not as good as the one in Japan, although it costs 1/3, and so on and so like. So it's very difficult, in other words, in short, to get out from the taboo which are very much imbued into the Japanese society. What is actually the Abenomic is looking for? Is, of course, short-term objectives are those that have been now explained, to create more liquidity in the market, to enable companies to invest plenty and keep the cost of money very low, and at the same time to stimulate the economy, at the same time to bring home incomes for the tax coffers in Japan, because I remind you that the public debt in Japan is 240% of GDP, which means it is 2 times the tragic one we have in Italy. Beyond this, what is really Japan looking for? What is the Abenomics aiming at with this third arrow, with the objectives for medium long term? It's aiming at devising a new socio-economic model for Japan, post-growth, post-developed country. And this entails 4 or 5 very important things. The first one is respect for the environment, to look after, find out which is the fine-tuning between resources and needs, more attention to the social injustices, and also to find the proper approach. We have discussed a lot in the previous panel about the foreign policy, to find a foreign mix which enables Japan to live in peace with the others and prosper economically. But definitely the question we had today, whether it is Japan is looking for sustainable growth or boom, is definitely not boom. Japan destiny is to become a medium-range economy, which will be more or less between the 5th and 10th position, not number 3, no longer number 2, not 3. Actually, I read from the panel that in 2030, the economy of Japan will be 1/4 of the United States. I remind you, in the 90s, it was 1/2. And it will be 1/3 of China, which used to be a fraction of Japan. I remind you that, for instance, China, the economy of India was 7 times the one of China in 1970. And now China is much way bigger than it is in India. Things are changing. Japan has lots of problems to solve, and Abenomics is one of the few ways that I think a first-class prime minister has been able to devise. First one is demography. Demography for Japan is tragic. It is 148 fertility rate, but somebody is worse than China, than Japan, and that's South Korea, for instance, which has 119. China is 169, so worsening very rapidly, and Germany is 146. So in a way, Japan is not badly placed. The problem is that Japan does not allow immigrations. We are compensating immigration, and the Japanese don't, or they do it in a very limited way. The story why this happens is always the same. The particularistic attitude of Japanese culture versus the universalistic approach of China. Actually, Professor Matsei said once that Japanese you are born, Chinese you can become. In reality, China have experienced the Mongol domination for almost 2 centuries and the Ming domination for a very long period. Japan has never had the domination of anybody in the 3,000 years of history that we know. And then, as I said, the public debt, the deindustrialization, if you look at the Japanese automobile companies, how much they are producing overseas, the low growth of consumptions is due to the fact that we had for 15 years deflation, stagnations. The seniority system of the Japanese companies, what was the real secret of the Japanese success in the 60s, in the 70s, now it has become a very big burden because you cannot promote younger people. Senior people are retiring with a very high salary. They are substituted by juniors. We get a fraction of their salary, and therefore the consumption is even more depressed. The curve of Smiley in economy, which is very important that you know, and the curve of Smiley means that you have to produce at very high, you have to add value. So Japan has a lot of problem to solve, and the Abenomics, which some Japanese ironically call Abe Maria, has a lot of advantages. It has, and I conclude, it has, for instance, increased the rate of inflation. It has weakened dramatically the yen, which is good news for exporting companies. It's very bad instead for imported goods. The stock market has recovered dramatically. Please remember, in 1989, it reached 36,000. It went down to 6,000, and now it's trailing between 14 and 16,000, which is not bad. Some GMP growth, not much, but still is there. Consumption tax, of course, has created a problem for the last few quarters. And very important, much more optimism, particularly in the business and the investors group. Is not popular with the normal people, the people in the street. 80%, the polls indicate that 80% are not satisfied at all of the situation. But all in all, Japan has a lot of problems, like all the industrialized countries, like us. And it has started much earlier than ourselves, 25 years ago, to do something serious. But it has not been to Abe's coming to power that we have seen something serious. And I believe we should encourage Mr. Abe to continue. This is the right way. Thank you.
Thanks. We had a first comment on our presentation, and I would like to give the floor now to Ambassador Vincenzo Petrone. Now he's president of Fincantieri, but has been for years ambassador in Japan and knows the Japanese world very well. Please.
Thank you, Professor. Most of what I wanted to say has been said already, so let me try to provoke a discussion among academics, at least, about some hard questions that need to be asked when we talk about Japan. Professor Osoya has reminded us of an excellent, in my view at least, report written by Richard Armitage and Joseph Nye, It was published in 2011. It was presented in Tokyo while I was there. With the big question, can Japan stay as a global player? And the title of this afternoon panel, in fact, is the corollary of that question. That is, the answer is yes, as long as Abenomics or something similar succeeds. The answer is absolutely no if Abenomics keeps going on the same path where it has been going so far. This is my opinion. And please, there is no, I have no scientific publication to prove my assertion. Now, of the three arrows that Prime Minister Abe promised he would be shooting, as we have heard so far, only two have been used with very little result. I will spend just a couple of words to go a little deeper into the why some of these arrows have not produced results. The third arrow was not implemented, was not fired, was not implemented, nor was it explained actually, because politically it was a hot issue and the Prime Minister decides not to go into details. So much so that the stock exchange, when he presented the third arrow, went down, it didn't go up. Now, why the first two arrows didn't work? Please keep in mind that the monetary and fiscal expansion that Mr. Abe has been implementing is the second. The first larger one was implemented by Prime Minister Noda in 2012 under the title, if you want to call it that way, of the reconstruction of the Tohoku struck by the earthquake of 11 March 2011. And that was a stimulus that amounted to over 700 billion US dollars. To that stimulus, Abe added a further stimulus of roughly 175 billion euros. So all in all, expressed in dollars, you have a stimulus that goes up to over 1 trillion US dollars. And the result is you're still stuck with an inflation of 1%, with a trade deficit for the last 24 months, and an overall demand situation that is still extremely modest. Now, one of the reasons for which this has not worked is that there has not been wage inflation. This is, I am deeply convinced of what I'm saying. Japan, contrary to the general opinion, Japan, in terms of labor market, is an extremely dualistic country. You have roughly 40% of the labor force that has little or no protection, little or no guarantees. A French journalist some time ago used the words, they are a sayonara away from unemployment. So these 40% of the workers that are presently in the labor market in Japan are all people whose salary can be compressed virtually at will, according to the needs of the manufacturing and service industry in the country. The second aspect I would like to spend a couple of words on, was touched already by Dr. Slater, if I'm not mistaken, concerns demographics. The lack of immigration is what Professor Volpi has already indicated, so there is nothing to add to that. But the point is that, there again, the political support for a possible policy of a more generous immigration regulation has no political support in the country. It does not have political support in the coalition. It does not have political support in parliament. It does not have political support in the public opinion. So the aim that Mr. Abe has set for himself of introducing a new legislation allowing immigration of 200,000 people per year, so that the decline in population would be stopping at the level of 100 million by the year 2030, 35, if I'm not mistaken, is a pure expression of sentiment, but it is not feasible in Japan at this moment. Now, let me make a few concluding remarks to stay in my 8-minute limit. From all I've been saying, I think one can draw a feeling of pessimism about the future of Japan. I'm not pessimist. Those who believe that Japan will stay in the third slot as an economy in the world ranking, of course, they are wrong. It will be the fifth, the sixth, and seventh. I can't tell that. But Japan has all the potential to remain a major global player. The point is that these structural reforms that very competently have been illustrated by my predecessors will not be implemented on the steam that the Japanese politics is willing to provide. This is, I think, a political recognition of a reality. So where does it come? Where can it come from? In my view, the key word is gaiatsu. This can only come from outside. Professor Plummer has been speaking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. I can add to that Europe is also trying to have a free trade agreement with Japan, making a lot of mistakes in my personal view, but serious mistakes, because they are politicizing an agreement that has to remain an economic and trade agreement, but Europe is usually tempted by, they want to mimic the global American status in Asia, which is, in my personal view, well, I will save the adjective I want to use. But to come back to the point, gaiatsu means, in my view, that for the third time in recent Japanese history, the Americans will have to open the country to a major deregulation effort that will allow the Japanese economy to become a real international economy. Will it come through the TPP? Probably, if the Americans stick to their guns up to the last minutes. It will come from a major crisis with China that will oblige Japan to become a more, how should I say, coherent partner of the Americans. Could be. I can't tell that. I'm not a magician. But what I can say is that left on its own, the Japanese political situation will not allow Abe or whoever becomes prime minister to implement those structural reforms that will make Japan a nation to be reckoned with in front of China in Asia. Thank you.
Thanks to Ambassador Petrone for a very clear view, even if without an adjective. Now I will give the floor to Ingegnere Pier Francesco Rimbotti, the President Infrastrutture SPA, and his firm has been working in Japan for a few years. Please.
Thank you very much, Professor, for giving me the word, and thank you for your attention. It's a bit dwarfing to speak after such interesting speeches and from people who have such a senior and long-term experience of Japan. The company I represent has been active in power and in energy since about 50 years. And we have been pioneers in renewable energy over the past 20 years in Italy and abroad. So we've been active in Japan only since 2 years. So, you know, it's really dwarfing to speak after such intervention. But I think there are a couple points which may make my experience interesting also for economists, etc. Because after all, renewable energy is dramatically different from what Japan has been experiencing for a long time. Renewable energy is about $500 billion investment yearly and has become now bigger than oil or coal or nuclear. So the reason we went to Japan was that after the great Fukushima disaster, it was fairly clear that the government was going to grow in renewable energy in a very big way. And actually that was before Prime Minister Abe got the helm of the government. So when Prime Minister Abe became Prime Minister, we were a bit concerned. But of course we found great stability in the government, and nothing really that was said by the previous Prime Minister was changed in any dramatic way. Other reasons why I went to Japan, it was fairly obvious from an Italian point of view. Remember, Italy has a long standing experience in renewable energy, that Japan was an island and was surrounded by countries which were actually not necessarily friendly or not necessarily friendly in any and all way. There were major apparent contrasts also from entrepreneurs' point of view, obviously China, Korea, Russia, all to do with energy. So this, I would like to say, is all the more interesting because other factors which really brought us to decide to go to Japan had to do with the complementarity between Japanese culture and way of doing business and Italian culture and way of doing business, which are dramatically different in many ways, but which can bring to tremendous synergy if put together to harness. So what did we find in 2 years' work? Well, we really found a very different scenario from what has been experienced worldwide in renewable energy. For example, most countries which have grown in renewable energy have seen this as a very international effort. Not so in Japan. Many of the companies which came from outside and went to invest in Japan were actually found enormous difficulties, and many of them, surprisingly enough, even in a booming sector like renewable energy, decided to go back home. And I'm talking about large companies, 4, 5, 6 billion revenues, which after 2-3 years effort have decided to go back home. Of course, what many companies that went to Japan found was this tremendous cultural divide, which can be seen in two ways. In one way is a divide, in another way is obviously is the extreme wealth. So bringing these things together, it can be extremely important for the companies that make it. So what I would like to put as a comment to many of my more academic and more in-depth analysis of what has happened is if really in Japan we can have and see the position which Prime Minister Abe is hoping without a real integration also of culture, of diversities. So we heard in the previous panel that Japan wants to become a very international force in those countries. Well, fine, but that has to go both ways. So it has to go from Japan abroad and from abroad in Japan. If not, it will not be perceived to do so. And similarly, in economics terms, I think that Japan not only, from foreign intervention, Japan is to gain a lot in terms of opening up its management to foreign diversity. Without this openness, also Japan's effort abroad will be less successful because let's face it, Japanese management in foreign countries do face difficulty in communication, etc., etc. So I would like to add that this is a tremendous challenge, the one of renewable energy, and it can be brought successfully. Maybe, we would like to see that it is recognized by governments both in Japan and outside as a major test to grow the vitality of the economics of both Japan and countries investing in Japan. Thank you.
Thanks for opening up another aspect of the Japanese economy prospect, energy problem, and specifically renewable energy. I would present my comment, and then I would like to ask the floor for questions, and the two main speakers will get 5 to 10 minutes each to answer to both discussant and questions from the floor. I would like to concentrate on one aspect that has been dealt to a certain extent by a few of previous speakers, and that is the problem of income distribution, because we know that the situation in Japan has been actually, the income distribution in Japan has been quite a negative component, and has been aggravating many of the Japanese economic problem. And in my opinion, there are at least two main changes that ought to be brought forward by Japanese government. On the one hand, as we have already seen from graph from Dr. Slater, corporate surpluses are, or if you like, corporate profits to a certain extent are too big. And one of the problem of Abenomics is exactly that real wages, not nominal wages, of course, but real wages has been lagging behind consumer prices. So the success of fighting deflation, bringing a bit of inflation into the Japanese economy, has meant that consumers were actually damaged, or if you like, workers and the consumers were actually damaged because their purchasing power diminished over time of the porters. And the second aspect, so some sort of redressing, more wages and less corporate surpluses. And on the other hand, the other big change would be a shift in taxation, because presently taxation is a bit too heavily bent on corporate sector, while other household sector, I am speaking of part of the retired people, pensioners are very, very lightly taxed. Not all pensioners, of course, because in many cases pensions are quite small. Anyhow, the taxation ought to be redirected from the corporate sector to the household, to the private sector, and specifically on indirect taxation, meaning not only personal direct taxes, but also indirect taxation. This is, of course, a big problem, because a second increase of the consumption tax that is due in October next year might kill Abenomics, might kill the few progress in both inflation and real economic growth. A small additional point that might become a very, very big problem for Japan in 20, 30 years are the so-called irregular workers. Irregular, as everybody knows, does not mean illegal or underground, means simply not full-time workers in the seniority system that is well known to everybody. Well, more than 1/3 of younger people, and younger means people below 35, so I am half young. Anyhow, more than 1/3 of younger people in Japan do not have a regular work, a regular job. This means that when they will become retired, when they will retire, they will have no savings and no pension, or better, only the public government pension that is very, very small. So Japan might find in 20, 30 year time a great layoff of poor people that actually would be very, very difficult to imagine now, because we know very well that Japan is a rich country, an affluent country, even if many people in Japan say that Japan is very rich, but Japanese are rather poor. I would like to stop here to give, yes, I have respected the minutes, to give the floor for a few questions. And Axel, please. A micro, or can you?
I've been talking all day already. Maybe a question in that case to Adam. When we speak about female participation in the workforce, this is really very low, and this has been a long. 48% is really very, very low. And we look at maybe you want to confirm this or put it straight. If Japan increases female participation situation, then economic growth could be boosted by up to 2%. Is that something you can confirm? Because this would, of course, make a huge difference. I'm not saying Japan is becoming like Norway or Sweden, but more or less like the rest of Europe. Italy, yes. The second issue is maybe also Mike and also Vittorio Volpi and also Ambassador Petrone. 240% of GDP, I mean, is public debt, very high. You know, that's probably, say, the Japanese economy is $6 trillion. That's $15 trillion. That's a lot of money that Japan is owing, but it's owing the money to the interest rate on public debt is 0.6%. So Paul Krugman would probably say, what's the big deal? No problem. Japan can easily repay 0.6% of public debt. However, of course, this might not last for very much longer. Society is getting older, and at some point, Japan will be forced to sell its debt on the international market. Do you know anything about the when this worst case scenario could kick in? Because if it does, then I will sell everything I own and put money on the mattress. Thank you very much.
Other questions? Maybe happy questions, even if you've gone over there.
Hello, my name is Luca Torri. I am, let me introduce myself, president of a company in Japan and managing director. Very small one, couple of billion Japanese. Just to go straight to the question, out of all your great discussion on macroeconomy is hitting microeconomy. Let me tell that my one is microeconomy. Will the, in your mind, exchange rate of Japan, yen versus US dollar, yen versus euro, will go back to 160? So like a few years ago, because what should Abe-san do? Print money to pay all his debts and devaluate the yen and help us to export? Thank you.
No more questions. So I think each of the two main speakers will have 10 minutes. It's a bonus for cutting the previous time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I think there's some very interesting comments that came forward. I saw in the discussions. I thought it was For example, this question of gaiatsu I thought was brilliant, because you used to only hear that in Japan in the context of foreign policy, but it really is important for domestic policy as well. And I wonder if that data that Dr. Slater put forward on low FDI levels isn't in part responsible for this problem. That you don't have the kind of pressure for reform from outside that, say, the United States has. Many of you look very young, but those of you that are my age might remember when President Clinton threatened Prime Minister Hashimoto with very high tariffs on luxury automobiles if the Longshoremen's Union were not liberalized. And using luxury automobiles as a way of sort of not hurting, giving the image of not hurting poor people in the US, but only rich people. And Lexus was a big company selling a lot of cars. And then what we saw that came out of that was that the very major foreign direct investment in the United States by Japanese firms, so capital and labor, protested strongly against Clinton. So Clinton eventually had to break down. And of course, we found out later the reason why Hashimoto won that was because I understand the government was kind of scared of it, because the Longshoremen's Union was, like in the US in the old days, dominated by organized crime. And I guess politicians were nervous about getting their knees shot out. But in any event, I think that this lack of having that kind of pressure group within the country is a problem. And if you look at the evolution of Japanese development in the keiretsu system that emerged after the war and everything, this was sort of built up as a way to keep out foreigners, be they domestic and outside. And I think that reforming that would allow for gaiatsu to happen at the local level as well. Agriculture was mentioned again. I think that's important. I thought it was interesting too to talk about Thai rice, because the story behind that with the Thai rice was that Japan, when it finally decided that it was going to buy some foreign rice, because there were lines, like bread lines in the Soviet Union, there were lines out to buy rice in one of the countries that had the highest per capita income in the world in the 1990s. And the government decided it would buy rice from Australia and the United States for human consumption, and from Thailand for animals, okay, essentially. And that's where it would go. But the crisis was so bad that they ended up using the Thai rice also for human consumption. And Japanese are great connoisseurs of rice. And so from that time on, they've always associated Thai rice, which were imports, were purposely low quality. They associate Thai rice with low quality. But as I mentioned, I think what's really important is that the restructuring of the agricultural sector is, not large in terms of the macroeconomic point of view. As we saw, it's less than 2% of GDP. It's always been that way, but rather as a way of preventing it from other structural reforms that might come through these regional arrangements, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, like the EU-Japan, like at the WTO, because agriculture has always been a problem. Particularly, it's been a very strong base of the LDP. The older people vote a lot more. There's a lot of gerrymandering in terms of the voting. And so what needs to happen is that reform, I think, is essential, not just for economic efficiency, but for a way of allowing structural reforms to take place. In terms of, I thought it was very interesting, the point about the opening up to technology transfer and these sorts of things. I think that when we open up to immigration, particularly skilled labor, but also other types, this is very important for technology transfer. And I think a problem that has always happened in Japan as it emerged over time was that you never saw much cross-cultivation of ideas because of the very rigid permanent job issue. So you didn't see firms that were, workers that were going from firm to firm, whereas if you look in Europe and if you look in the United States, employees can change relatively frequently, and they bring with them new ideas, and this allows each company to sort of learn more from each other, and that becomes very important. To the extent you don't have that happen, you don't have that fluid process, it's a problem. Another problem has to do with the educational system, and I think this is what Mr. Rimbotti was talking about as well, is that the educational system itself needs to be more cognizant of the need to have these foreign ideas, to give incentives to have executive education, to have MBAs. Hey, traditionally, a Japanese employee would graduate from college and work for a firm forever. What use is an MBA? You get taught everything they need within the company. An MBA allows professionals to move from firm to firm. That's good for the professional. It's good for everyone. So I think there's a lot that can be done also on the educational side. I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Wow, well, lots of points to cover. I'm going to try to deal with questions from the floor first and just move the mic a little further away, in fact. Okay. Axel's question on female participation, I think this is, for me, the one really big area that Japan could achieve something domestically at a relatively low cost without perhaps some of the huge political constraints there are elsewhere, and which could have a really notable effect on what is a really key medium-term problem, which is a shrinking labor supply. There really is a huge problem here. What tends to happen is Japanese women take a job and then they drop out of the labor market, usually straight after they've had a child, and never come back into it again. So they have some participation, but it doesn't tend to be sustained. There are probably a lot of cultural factors sitting behind that, and I'm not sufficiently clued up on Japanese culture to really comment. But it seems to me that if we look at other societies, female participation has been raised very substantially over the last 50, 100 years. And it is something that Japan, if they really wanted to do, could do, and would be very positive for the economy. How big depends on how big you get it up, how much of an increase you achieve, and over what time period. But your number isn't completely outlandish over an extended period. With regard to the public debt, the gross debt is 250% of GDP. The net debt, taking off government assets, is more like 150. So it is perhaps slightly less alarming than it appears immediately. Japan's fiscal problem, from my perspective, is still a medium-term problem rather than something which is going to go wrong next year or the year after. There is still space to solve this problem without catastrophe. The question, I think, is whether or not they are going to put in place a coherent fiscal framework to do that. They can. The tax to GDP ratio in Japan is relatively low by international standards, so there is something you can do on that side. I think what is unfortunate, if we return to the issue of the consumption tax, which I think is linked to this, is that for some reason which I find a little difficult to understand, Japan wanted to proceed in big jumps with the consumption tax, 2 very large increases in back-to-back years, which would double the rate. I don't really understand why, instead of such a steep increase, that there wasn't instead a plan to increase it on a much more graduated basis over a longer period. I think that would have achieved much the same in terms of building fiscal confidence for the medium term without imposing these very big shocks on the economy. I find this a puzzling decision. Yes, the issue has always been there. They've always said that it's growth dependent. So if Q3 is as weak as we think it will be, I think there's quite a high chance they'll think about it again. And I think that will be a sensible thing to do. But as I mentioned in my comments initially, it wouldn't be a great advertisement for the overall construction of the program. To be perfectly fair to the Abe government, these increases were programmed in before they took office by the previous government. So they had to sort of work around them, but you can change things. With regard to the question from the floor about exchange rates. 160, I wouldn't rule it out over a 2 or 3 year period if things go badly wrong, because if, for example, next year the economy starts to lurch back towards deflation, the obvious policy move will be a big further monetary expansion, and I think that would translate into considerable yen weakness. So if we were starting from 108, 110 level, where could we go with another 20%? We wouldn't be very far away from the gentleman in the audience's number. I would say that was still a tail risk rather than a mainstream risk, but it's not an outlandish possibility. I'd just probably like to make a couple more observations as well. The demographic story, one thing that's worth mentioning is this is not just a problem for Japan, it's actually an Asia-wide phenomenon, and it's happening to countries all at different levels of GDP per head, at different levels of development. We not only have negative demographics in Japan, we have them also in Korea, we have them in Thailand, and we have them in China. China is a little different from the others because it's achieved this demographic anti-dividend by its own extremely peculiar policies, but nevertheless that trend is there. So from the broader perspective of what happens to the power relationships in the region, the demographic issue is not just a Japan issue, it actually also impinges on these other countries as well. And then perhaps just mention the issue of internationalization and Japan wanting to do it in one direction only. I think this is a recurring theme. There are aspects of internationalization that Japan has been comfortable with. There are aspects of internationalization that Japan has not been comfortable with. And I don't think that's going to change very much. For example, Japan has been very reluctant to allow foreign investment in the economy, but it's been quite keen to invest overseas, and increasingly so, in fact, over the last couple of decades, partly as a result of cost issues and trying to minimize exchange rate swings and the effects of those. Ironically, one result of that has been that Abenomics, or the yen depreciation element of it, has been rather less successful than we might initially have expected, because Japan, having shifted so much production offshore, has meant that the response from exports has been weaker than it might have been 20, 25 years ago. In terms of the labour market, I think something worth mentioning here is that there's a compositional change going on there as well. It isn't just that people are not getting wage rises, it's that the low wage portion of the workforce is growing, and that's happening for a number of reasons. It's happening because older people are participating in greater numbers, but at lower wages than when they were full-time employees in the regular workforce. And because of this issue of the growing share of partially attached people in irregular contracts. So wage inflation is a structural problem as well, and one that won't necessarily be solved by, for example, larger companies changing their policies in terms of wage increases or paying out bigger dividends and so on. Final comment, will Japan be satisfied with things as they are? I mean, I think the big issue probably for this medium-term perspective is we've had 20 odd years of relative decline in Japan, which has not caused huge social ructions, huge political ructions. The Japanese have lived with it. If Abenomics even has minor successes in terms of perhaps ending deflation, even if we go to zero inflation or 1% inflation in the medium term, will that be enough? Will that be enough to ward off the more severe fiscal tail risks, for example? Will it be enough to provide sufficient, even if it's modest, income growth over time that most people are reasonably happy and don't want to do really dramatic things to upset the status quo? It seems to me there's quite a high chance the answer to that will be yes, that genteel decline is actually something that a lot of people in Japan are relatively happy with. And if that is so, then some of the political barriers which we've noted to some of the more really radical structural reforms are going to stay in place. They might even be reinforced in some cases.
And I think we can close this session, and actually the afternoon. I would like to thank very, very quickly both the speakers and the discussant, including myself, of course, and the audience for the active participation. Thanks.
Grazie.